Right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the third of our webinar series for ACGR for 2025. My name's Tracy Sullivan. I'm the Executive Director of the Australian Council of Graduate Research, and we're really excited today to have Professor Charlotte Brownlow and Professor Inga Mewburn here to talk about HDR supervision for neurodiverse students and how we go about developing inclusive and respectful practices. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm coming to you from today, the Darug people, and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to extend that respect to the traditional elders of the lands that you're all joining us from today, and to also welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people on this call today. We've had a great response to this webinar. Lots of people are very interested in this topic, so we're very fortunate to have Charlotte and Inga here today. Charlotte, Professor Charlotte Brownlow is the Dean of the Graduate School at the University of Southern Queensland. Southern Queensland. She has a background in psychology and her research focuses primarily on autism, collaborating and co-producing research with the autistic and autism communities. She was previously the co-chair of the Australasian Autism Research Council and is a current member of the Queensland Disability Research Network. Charlotte's also leading our ACGR working group tasked with developing a set of good practice guidelines for the supervision of neurodiverse candidates. We also are joined by Professor Inga Mewburn, who's the Director of Research and Development at the Australian National University, where she oversees all of the professional development workshop and programs for all ANU researchers. You will know her from the Thesis Whisperer, and she writes scholarly papers and books about research education with a special interest in post-PhD employability, research communications and neurodivergence. And I'll also note that a lot of the learnings that you'll hear and listen to today are from a preprint paper that has currently been produced by Inga and Charlotte and a team around understanding the experiences of neurodiverse research students, which was a systematic review, and we'll share that information with you in the chat and access to that paper a little later. So not to take up more time, I'd like to hand over to Charlotte Brownlow. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. And hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming along. It's always wonderful to be amongst people who enjoy looking and learning about the same things that I enjoy learning about. So thank you for making time to come and meet with us today. So I'm actually going to hand over to Inga, who's going to be driving our presentation, and we're going to do a bit of a tag team as we move through. So Inga, over to you.
Thanks, Charlotte. I'm just presenting here in Mentimeter. If you're not familiar with it, it's interactive. And so we can do a few questions. We can run our questions through here. You can also click on links directly to the things that we talk about. So it's quite easy to get in. You can just aim your phone at that QR code there, or you can open up another window browser as you're watching and go to menti.com, use that code there. If you're watching us later, the Menti will be open for another 2 days with that code, and we'll send a PDF extract of it to you, Tracy, if you want to distribute it after that. So you don't have to get in, but it just is a very easy way for us to collaborate. If you lose focus on it, or you've joined us later, or you haven't joined now and you feel like you want to later on, I'll use that code, leave that code sitting up the top, so you can at any time go to Menti and enter that code. So we're talking about HDR supervision. That's our focus today, but in order to do that, we need to talk about the experience of our HDR candidates. So we're going to focus on what the research tells us, and then out from that, develop some questions about it that you might want to think and talk about. So hopefully we'll have enough time for a discussion. We are going to talk about mental health and trauma as well as neurodivergence. We prefer the term neurodivergence to neurodiversity. In the community generally that talks about these things, I've learned over time, we're all neurodiverse. Everyone has a different brain. There is no standard brain somewhere that someone measures every brain against. So everyone has a different brain. So neurodiverse would maybe describe all of us to some extent, although there is sort of sometimes what we call a more neurotypical way of operating. And then there's more clusters of different types of neurodivergence that people can identify or sometimes be diagnosed with. So part of what we're going to talk today about is language, and I'm going to leave that for Charlotte to expand further. There's Charlotte and all the clever things she does. Charlotte and I knew each other for a while. Actually, I think we met at a tea table at ACGR years ago, I think in Wollongong, Charlotte. And I blog on Thesis Whisperer. And so I just sort of wrote a blog post in 2023. I went on a bit of sabbatical and started thinking about this stuff because it seemed to me like the great unknown. I was encountering HDR candidates who would disclose to me autism, ADHD diagnoses, and I didn't have much of a tool in the toolbox to help. So I thought I needed to study it, started writing about it on Thesis Whisperer. And thanks to Charlotte for reaching out and saying, hey, are you doing anything? I'm like, yeah, I'd like to, but I feel a bit nervous. This is a whole new area for me. Charlotte brought all her expertise and all her friends with expertise. And now we've been working together, I think, for over a year, Charlotte. And it's been a really great research collaboration. They've taught me a lot. So Diana Tan, Kate Simpson, Chris Edwards and Amanda Webster, the other members of the team for the paper we're going to talk about. I'll share with you the other team members that are the second part of the research that we're doing at the moment. We've just finished a paper on AI and neurodivergent practices around AI. So Diana is the lead author on the paper. Diana's at Macquarie University and her specialism is in autism. And she also studies trauma in education settings. So that's quite important. It's a pity she couldn't join us today. We did really want her to come and present because she is the lead author and being mentors as Charlotte and I wish to do, because Diana's earlier in her career, it's a bit of a missed opportunity, but we do miss her today. She's an incredible talent. Just leave this up for a moment. I'm wondering about you. Like, a lot of people signed up, which quite shocked us, and there was only one advertising sent out. I'm wondering why you came along today, what questions you have, what's motivating you, because these seminars don't always get this much attention. So we're interested in what you're seeing. So you can type anything into here. It doesn't come up with your name. I can't see your name at the back end either. Your questions help us because they help us if we're doing this research and it is ongoing about what's concerning you or what you're seeing in practice. That helps us create scope. Or if maybe you yourself have a diagnosis or some suspicions and you don't want to disclose, this is a safe space to do it. Just keep it safe for work because everyone's going to see it. We're just interested in your questions. I'll just give you a moment there. And I'm loving seeing that people want to learn more about supporting neurodivergent students. You're maybe starting to recognise it. And I think one of the things that motivated me in this, besides the fact that my own son identifies as autistic, most people in my family, including my father, are either autistic, ADHD, OCD, or some of their combinations thereof. So that's my lived experience. And probably I'd certainly test high on autistic traits myself, although I don't tip over into a diagnosis. So a lot of us have lived experience, but we're also entering an age where we've got people like my son, who's 23, who've come through a much more neuro-inclusive, friendly education system that's accepted, embraced. People have got diagnosis, and sometimes their parents are getting diagnosis at the same time. So we've got this sort of new emerging awareness of the prevalence of it. And one of the questions I had going into this research is, are academics more neurodivergent than most of the population? I'm still wondering if it's actually our special skill and our strength is this hyper focus and things like that. So are we actually maybe more of us on the spectrum than we actually have any awareness around? And self-awareness on both sides, I'll talk about that more. I think I'm handing over to you next. And I will just put that up for you and go for it. Charlotte, tell me when you want the next slide.
Beautiful. Thank you, Inga. So just a bit of context setting, and Inga's already started the story beautifully for us. In terms of how we're approaching our work, we're really seeing neurodivergence as an umbrella term. So there's going to be a whole range of identities that sit underneath this. So autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, they tend to be the real kind of major identities that are discussed within this more umbrella bracket. But a lot of the work that Inga and I are doing kind of moves from the very specific into the more kind of umbrella neurodivergence term. So we're going to be taking a very much an identity first approach. So when we talk about language, it will be from an identity first preference rather than from a person first. We're trying to be as inclusive as possible within our research. So we're saying that people can be diagnosed, they can be seeking, they can be self-diagnosed, they can be querying those identity terms and just be not sure. So we're trying to be inclusive in terms of who we're considering and who we're bringing into the research. Acknowledging that a neurodivergent person may also identify as disabled, there's lots of different narratives around that. Estimates in terms of population, it's so broad, and Inga and I have spent a lot of time trying to actually work out exactly what kind of figure rests within this, but the estimates are as high as 15 to 20% of the general population. So we're talking about a significant and important part of our population. Thanks, Inga. So with the note on language, we've already said that we're looking at the identity first. And I love this cartoon. I think it really kind of captures why identity first is important. And it's that recognition that, the identity is part of us. It's ingrained within us. It's not something we carry around. We don't sit upon it. We don't suffer from it. It's just who we are. So it's very much trying to create a very inclusive, identity first perspective that we're working on. So you'll hear us talk about autistic people, etc., etc. Thanks, Inga. Okay, so I'm sure a lot of you have come across the work of Damien Milton. So Damien Milton is a UK academic. He's an autistic UK academic, and he talks a lot about what he considers to be the double empathy problem. And I think this is really important when we think about HDR supervision, because it's a very much a small kind of targeted relationship that an individual's having with other individuals. So the double empathy problem, how described by Milton, is recognizing that he talks about autistic people, but we can broaden this to neurodivergent people, that autistic people experience the world quite differently to non-autistic people. So there's a difference in terms of how people are experiencing the world. But what Milton argues that sometimes this makes it quite difficult for two quite different groups of people to actually understand each other. So this is what Milton considers to be the double empathy problem. But what's interesting is that the double empathy problem doesn't necessarily go both ways. So there's an ingrained expectation that autistic people are just expected to learn non-autistic ways and non-autistic culture. So they're expected to learn different communication styles, etc., etc. But that expectation doesn't necessarily go the other way. So non-autistic people aren't necessarily put the onus on them to actually change to understand the perspective from the other people. So from what we find is that autistic people tend to be more skilled at navigating non-autistic spaces and non-neurodivergent spaces, and they tend to be better at doing that than people coming from the other direction. So in terms of a lot of the double empathy problem tends to focus on autism, but we know that not all neurodivergent people can face a lack of understanding. So there's lots of nuances within this. But the core is within this idea, I guess, is that understanding each other and appreciating that we all have different skills and challenges is going to be crucial. So we need to start from that understanding that people are going to think differently, and some people are expected to move and adapt more than others. Thanks, Inga. Okay, so just thinking broadly about neurodivergent people as students, there's lots of crossovers here with a whole range of different people. So, I mean, who does like group work? It's always challenging, it's always difficult. Managing big personalities is a bit of a nightmare. But, you know, for the neurodivergent HDR student, if they're faced with multi-supervisor teams, it can be quite a challenging activity, especially if, you know, the supervisors don't always follow the same kind of script. We can see that there's lots of reported overload on executive function. There's all sorts of challenges in terms of trying to find safe spaces or safe enough spaces to be themselves. So this goes back to what Inga was referring to at the start around that kind of safety to disclose and safety to be authentic and kind of be yourself. There's a range of sensory sensitivities, time blindness, face blindness, all of those kind of things, which makes some of these struggles as students just slightly harder for neurodivergent students. But of course, we've also got a lot of strengths. So we know that neurodivergent people see things slightly differently, which often is a real benefit in terms of research. And we all kind of can see when we can see things differently, it makes really important impacts on our research. Some people might struggle with difficulties in transition and change, and we know that research is unpredictable, and this can be quite tricky. And of course, neurodivergent people are coming into this with a background often of quite a history of educational trauma, and we'll come to this when we talk about the systematic literature review in a little while. And mixed into all this are feelings of anxiety and some quite significant impacts on individual mental health. Thanks, Inga. Okay, so what do we know so far about the experiences of neurodivergent people in the PhD? Well, Inga and I embarked with the colleagues that Inga's just talked about on a systematic literature review. So we completed this at the end of last year. We've got a preprint that you can link to, and I'm sure Tracy will be happy to share that afterwards. What we did was we took a mixture of empirical research and lived experiences, because the literature out there at the moment is quite mixed and it's quite limited. So we went through 959 articles, we screened all of those articles, and we managed to come up with 31 articles that we really felt was actually focused on the experiences of neurodivergent PhD students. So interestingly, they tended to be very small cases or individual case studies. And again, I think, we've got questions about difficulty with recruitment, but also difficulty with disclosure. So we know that there's a whole range of reasons that this research field isn't better represented and kind of bigger. Thanks, Inga. So at a glance, what we could see was there's some really key themes that came through these papers. So you can see the papers at a theme at a glance on the screen here. But there's lots of challenges around the structures that make up academic institutions, and the kind of challenges that this causes for a whole range of different reasons, right from ableism and disclosure up to embracing, or the importance of embracing neurodivergence. So if we have a look at these in a little bit more detail.
Next slide.
Yes, thanks, Inga. What was interesting was that of the 31 papers, the academic cultures, structures and expectations were really highly represented within the papers that we examined. So in terms of experiences, there was that concerns about unwritten rules, about toxic cultures, about that pressure to publish. And of course, the all-important requirements to network at conferences, which is terrifying at the best of times. So there's all sorts of pressures that are kind of being put on there, plus that extra kind of layer of bureaucracy that has all of this hidden curriculum underneath. So there's all sorts of issues with the way that we set up structures and the way we have expectations. Sensory and environmental challenges, shared office spaces, impacts on ability to process information. While there's some acknowledgement that as academics we work from home quite a lot, it's not always possible for certain disciplines. So people working in labs, those kind of sensory and environmental challenges were quite stark. In terms of executive functioning, there was a real kind of line and theme that went through around, actually, it's not only about one particular level of functioning. People's functioning levels move and fluctuate across hours, days, months, weeks, etc., etc. So often students are really pushing themselves to the limit, which means that they're experiencing burnout, exhaustion, all of those other quite negative impacts on an individual. And with all of these challenges, there was lots of confusion about what supports were actually available and what kind of accommodations could be made, particularly for HDR students. And I think, in our own universities, often we have a very good understanding about how we can accommodate undergraduates, but for research students, it's a bit more of a challenging space. So lots of kind of confusion, as well as experiences of kind of stigmatization and shame when they did actually go through and look for what accommodations and supports were available to them at their particular university. Thanks, Inga. Okay, the other kind of important themes that ran through were the importance of being surrounded by the right people. So that importance of finding your people, and in that absence of a network of peers, it becomes all that much more difficult. So that we saw much more reliance on supervisory teams. So relationships with others was a real challenge. Linked to the other point that we've just made, there was a real theme around ableism and disclosure. So in order to request the required accommodations and supports, you needed to disclose, but then there's all sorts of negative repercussions around stigma, discrimination, ableism. All of those narratives were really being reported by the people who were contributing to the papers. I think worryingly, but not unsurprisingly, all of these really impacted on people's reports of their mental health, around that kind of unpredictability being quite anxiety provoking, and often that kind of extra work that they're doing to kind of maintain progress with their research means that often their own needs were overlooked. So we're seeing lots of burnout, we're seeing lots of extra emotional labour that needs to be put in place just to maintain their perception of being a credible PhD student and academic. What was interesting was there was a huge call for a much more of a narrative of embracement of neurodivergence. So that notion that acceptance is empowering. And some, quite positively, encouragingly, had managed to find a space where actually, you know, the neurotypicality was not assumed. So it was okay to be yourself. And that kind of acceptance, excuse me, was seen as a really kind of empowering move for students. Thanks, Inga. So in terms of wrapping up some of the themes that we found across the SLR, we came up with a few narratives that seem to cut across all of those themes, which mean that universities and academic institutions are quite a nuanced kind of space that individuals are trying to operate within. So the first thing that really cut through all of these themes was this notion of this hidden curriculum and power relations. So lots of examples of, you know, the consequences of the implicit expectations, which people aren't really sure exactly what the expectations are because it's all part of a hidden curriculum, means that there's lots of hesitancy to disclose, which means masking becomes much more required, which impacts on individuals, etc., etc. So we can see the kind of circle that goes through. We also know that those power dynamics between supervisors and students is problematic anyway, and again becomes problematic for these students in particular. The second thing is around this notion of ableism in university administration and that bureaucracy. So systems are difficult to navigate. It can often exclude neurodivergent scholars, which again leads to that kind of frustration and exhaustion, but also that real reinforcement of otherness. So, you know, I'm not part of this institution. I'm someone other to what these systems are designed for. And again, that repeated connection with mental health, which was a real concern in the literature. And then finally, the final theme or a big theme that ran through, the thread that ran through all the themes, was this recognition of individual history of educational trauma. So, you know, HDR students, they've typically got a whole history of being branded a failure by the various different education systems that they've been part of, right from primary school all the way through secondary school, undergraduate, and now in HDR study. So it's that kind of being branding of a failure and that trauma that is invoked by that identity that's crafted for them as opposed to by them. So it's that kind of perpetuating those feelings of inadequacy and that sense of not belonging. So all of these things are working together that really leads to othering neurodivergent HDR students. And of course, obviously, students end up becoming hopefully more academics who are active in their research, etc., etc. but that otherness is still there. So the university systems are a real challenge, and they're building upon a history of problematic educational experiences that come before. So I'll pause there talking about the systematic literature review, and what I'll do is hand back to Inga, who's going to unpack those kind of experiences of academics within universities, of which HDR students are one. Thanks, Inga.
Thanks, Charlotte, because it's not just the candidates who are neurodivergent, there's us supervisors. So I don't necessarily claim an autistic identity, but I've done enough tests now to see that I'm very close to whatever threshold there is that gives one a diagnosis. And my experience through schooling was simultaneously being in a gifted program and in a remedial program at the same time. I remember one time I was in school and I was in two separate programs, one of which was telling me I was not good enough and the other one was telling me that I was gifted, and I just didn't know where I was anymore. And now I've got a niece who's in a similar situation. So they can have a history of trauma that is not necessarily that you're always a failure, but you end up very confused about what your talents and skills are, and that self-understanding can be difficult. And you might think through the index of candidates that you've had experience with, and I'm sure you've met them. You know, they're those extraordinary people often who come through and you're like, how did you find your way here? But awesome. And so I deal with a lot of all the PhD students at ANU. I don't see all researchers. My specialty is PhD. Anyway, so I'm interested in us because my personal experience of having a family member and then investigating myself and looking at my father and then looking around me and going, oh, I am also one of you in some way. I don't know quite how I fit, but I definitely have traits. So that informed my approach to this research. And I started doing this other stream of research in parallel, and then Charlotte came along and then we did that. And now I'm trying to blend the streams in together and bring us all together because I started designing a survey. So one thing I noticed when I was reading the literature is there's just not many numbers, and numbers give me comfort, for better or for worse. And one of the numbers that puzzled me was that always this 15 to 20% estimate of neurodivergence. I'm like, well, how was that arrived at? Because it's one of those things that every time you click on it, every reference, and you try and trace all the references back, there's no there. Everyone refers to someone else who refers to someone else who refers to someone else, just sort of leaves it. And it never goes back to any kind of study. So I wanted to put out a survey. I, through the blog, gathered a big reference group and now has 900 people on my mailing list who are interested in the topic of neurodivergent PhD studies. Many of them are PhD students, but many are academics who have diagnosis or are suspecting. And so that was a great network through which to send my survey, and probably might have influenced the statistics that I found, because I'm seeing at least double the sort of general population level of autism. Sorry, not just autism, but neurodivergence. So what we framed this study is just as a study of academic work, and seeing neurodivergence as one of the biodemographics that we collected on the way in. We also collected caring, and all sorts of other extras like financial precarity, which is very important, I think, in how people function at work and so on. So we wanted to see neurodivergence as being in the mix with a bunch of other intersectional factors, financial security, representation, because everything is intersectional and it's not just one thing that really drives our life experience. Through a very long process of consultation with that big reference group and with Elizabeth Cook, we got a range of scales around productivity, stress, focus, sense of belonging, and we put in AI at the very last minute. So we have 1,234 valid responses. There's about 1,500 in there, but not all of them finished. And so they're reporting neurodivergence at about twice the rate. So the first paper that we're doing from that is on AI use, because we popped a question in at the last minute, and then we started working on it last August, thinking there was nothing published on AI. In the meantime, everything has come out about AI, and there's so much literature, everyone's obsessed with it, but this one's on whether it's an assistive technology. So the people that of the broader research team who have been working on this paper is Elizabeth Cook there at Edith Cowan, Karen Oakley at the University of Canberra, who, so Elizabeth Cook's background, she identifies as neurodivergent. She also has a background in studying higher education. Karen is a psychologist with a specialism in treating trauma and ADHD. And Professor Alice Richardson, I call her the stats goddess of ANU. She runs our statistics consulting network. One of the things that we did was, instead of asking people if they had autism or ADHD, is take a non-diagnostic approach, so take an identity approach. And that's very hard. We asked people to identify neurodivergent, seeking a diagnosis or self-diagnosed, I'm not sure, no, and I don't want to answer. So we've got a broad range of people. The first 3 people, lots of people, were gated through into this traits inventory. So we developed a series of statements that describe the neurodivergence experience at work. I'll just let you read it for a moment because there's a lot of text on the screen. So I developed this inventory, and you're welcome. I read hundreds and hundreds and maybe a couple of thousand comments on Reddit, and there's a couple of Reddit communities there that just talk about being neurodivergent at work, and it's a rich source of lived experience. So I went through and I thought, what are the barriers and the challenges and also the strengths that people bring to their work that these people seem to identify, and use them as our inventory of traits. We're doing some more statistical work to see what these traits are predictive of, and Karen's very interested in whether this is sort of an alternative way of exploring neurodivergence in workforces, rather than ask people if they have diagnosis, develop scales around these traits, and then see if we can use those as a sort of criteria. So just talking about AI really quickly, I finished the paper yesterday, and yes, I used heaps of AI to do it. So full disclosure. We found that people used AI at about the same rate. So 75% of people disclosed using it, and they were using it for the same things that's reported in that big McDonald report that came out from the University of Queensland. So we thought, why reinvent the wheel? We were seeing the same things. We looked at writing, admin, research, and teaching prep as being the primary things that people were doing. But then we looked at and split the cohort into neurodivergent versus non-neurodivergent. And then we looked at what the likelihood of them using it for particular purposes for. And we found clearly that they're more likely to use it for writing tasks and for admin, things like writing emails, interpreting other people's emails, and so on. Both of these tasks are demanding in terms of theory of mind, imagining what the other person is thinking at any point in time, and executive functioning, placing one thing in front of the other. So that made sense. We then looked more closely, we did what's called a gerund analysis, where we looked at the ing endings of verbs to look at how they were seeing AI as part of their process at work. Most of them just gave us instrumental. I use this tool, this tool, this tool, this tool, but there was a range of responses. I haven't got the number. I think it's 187. No, it's bigger than that. I haven't got the number right in front of me, who talked about AI as a kind of companion at work. So then we went further down and we tried to look at what type of companion is being implied here. When people talk about using AI continuously throughout the day or very often, what are they imagining it to be? So we saw that they were imagining it as a colleague, either as an equal peer or a slightly junior peer, an assistant, a PA, a research assistant, someone to motivate them, to get them started on the blank page. I sort of had started describing this as being like those people who hold a water bottle as someone's running a marathon. They're the person handing you the water bottle. As the imagined ideal student, you can imagine for someone who's neurodivergent, who finds theory of mind, imagining what other people are thinking or navigating those neurotypical expectations, using AI to kind of model that student in advance and test things on. There weren't very many descriptions of that, but I thought it was very interesting. And then this last category, I'm calling it service dog. If you're familiar with the idea of a service dog, if you are prone to epileptic fits, a service dog can be trained to smell that that's about to happen and to get you to lie down so you don't hurt yourself. They're highly, highly trained, sensitive to the emotional and physical state of the human that they work with, all sorts of conditions. And people were using AI as an assistive technology, kind of like a service dog, to help them navigate those neurotypical expectations, to help with tasks like masking. Masking is a term we haven't mentioned yet, but it's pretending not to be neurodivergent. So some people would say, for instance, oh, the tone of my email, people always get offended. I don't mean to offend people. So I use it to tell me whether I'm being offensive. And in fact, this is where I start to think I'm pretty high in the autism traits, because I have one of those Claudes to tell me when I'm being offensive, because I can be a bit blunt with people as well. I see Anne Evans is on the line, so she knows what I mean. She has to manage me. Thank you, Anne. I appreciate you. All right. I'm going to think I'm handing back to you, Charlotte, at this point. I did say you were doing this.
That's perfect. No, that's perfect. Thank you, Inga. So I guess, you know, we're trying to make sense of all of those different threads that Inga and I have just spoken about for the last half an hour or whatever, in trying to kind of make sense, well, what do we do with all of that information? You know, how can we best support HDR students broadly, of course, but how can we particularly improve our practice to be much more inclusive, and particularly much more neuro-inclusive in terms of our supervision? So what we know from a whole bunch of other work is, you know, there's a baseline that will work for everyone, but we know that often the baseline is challenging for everyone, plus there's a whole range of additional challenges that neurodivergent people are managing. So we've alluded to, you know, the masking, the ableism, the you know, additional emotional labor, etc., etc. So some of these things that we're going to talk about are just good practice and supervision that we should be doing anyway, but some things are particularly important in order to be much more inclusive in our supervision practices. So the first thing that we need to consider is it's a massive change for students. So students are coming from undergrad, honours, masters, all of those kinds of programs where it's that kind of one-to-many support as opposed to one-to-one. So that relationship is going to be challenging for a lot of students to navigate. And of course, inherent within these relationships are all sorts of power relationships between the supervisor and the student, but often power relationships between the supervisor and supervisor. So we've got a lot of things going on in that very intense one-on-one relationship. So we need to think about how that kind of change is going to be managed and what kind of ground rules are going to be put in place. So part of that is going to be really working hard to create a supportive environment that's going to facilitate success. So the student, they need to feel that their voice is being heard, and this needs to be heard in an authentic way. So not just kind of that lip service, it really needs to be kind of meaningful engagement. And, you know, we need to be really mindful of their own preferences in terms of cognitive style. So I supervise a lot of neurodivergent HDR students, and they're all very different, surprise, surprise, yeah? So they're all very, very different. And we need to be flexible in terms of working with them, with people all as individuals, but really thinking about the different cognitive styles. So, and that we know that student supervisor agreement is a good practice. We know that it gives students security, it gives them predictability in terms of what they can expect from their supervisors. But it might be even more important for this particular group of students. So thinking about regular meetings, thinking about agreed feedback timeframes and methods, and understanding all of those other really complex negotiations that go on with issues of publications and IP. No one likes having the conversations about not only who's on a paper, but what order names go in. This is difficult territory that we're asking students to navigate. Feedback from some of my students is in terms of never give me feedback in a meeting. So I never want to receive feedback on the fly because you didn't have time to read it beforehand. I need it written. I need it you know, sent to me beforehand, and I need to be able to digest it before I can talk to you about it. So take time to understand some of those you know, cognitive preferences that students will have. And also recognise that emotional processing can be quite different for different people. So just like Inga said, some people are happy with that very kind of blunt, direct feedback. Other people aren't. So again, you know, one of my students in particular is, look, you know, if you've got feedback, just be clear on what that feedback is. Don't dress it up into, I really like this and this was lovely, but actually this is a problem. Just tell me what the problem is. So it's about that kind of really capturing of appropriate communication styles. It's also thinking a little bit broadly about things we take for granted. So one of my other students is, likens research to a bit of a sandwich. So her argument is that as researchers and supervisors, we're so focused on that filling. Okay, so that filling might be going out and doing a semi-structured interview with a group of people. So that's what we focus on. But for her, everything is wrapped around that. So it's that preparation for it, it's that building up to it, it's that planning, that managing all those, you know, expectations that may or may not happen. And at the end of it, on the other side of that filling, it's what happened during it. How can we process that? How can we think about what happened? How can we move closure and move on? So it's very much, we need to think a bit broadly about what some of the points that we're asking students to do. And we focus on one bit, but there's a massive context that sits around that. So we need to think a little bit differently. Thanks, Inga. If we can move on to the next one.
There's one more slide, yeah.
There is just one more slide. And so I guess the big kind of question is, what are we going to do with all of this information? We know there's not enough research out there. There's much, much more work to be done. And I think just the two examples that we've given you really kind of lends to that lack of empirical research that's currently out there. So we need much more work done in this area. We're trying to do follow-up. We're going to do follow-ups to the survey with life histories and interviews, because it's become quite apparent that some of the things that Inga's found in her surveys actually needs unpacking that little bit more. So while there's you know, not quite enough information, we know that we do need to unpack some of the information that we've got.
If I can interject there, just
please.
For instance, it seems that being neurodivergent and male is protective, but being neurodivergent and female is not. So, for instance, things like that, we can see that statistically, but we need to figure out, it seems like we're still working on our stats and we're trying different ways through it. So that's why. And we also are having trouble publishing. Just reminding you to have a whinge about that, please, Charlotte. Thank you.
I'll be sure to have a whinge about publication. But I think that's a really, really good example of, you know, those kind of additional barriers that some people are facing within these broader, you know, huge institutions. So, you know, it's only through kind of qualitative life history work that we're actually going to get to a better understanding as to individual experiences and what that means. And ultimately, you know, we are trying to kind of shift thinking across these bigger organisations. So we're going to need supports that help that navigation. It's going to be a really tricky path for anyone, but navigating all of these unwritten rules, all of these power structures, all of this bureaucracy is a real challenge for neurodivergent students. But what we do know is that the supports, whatever we create, they need to be co-designed and they need to be collaboratively with neurodivergent scholars, so HDR students and HDR supervisors. So we really need to make sure that we're doing that kind of co-produced research if these supports are going to be A, inclusive, but B, appropriate and effective. We also need to really encourage that self-reflection piece in our supervisors. And I think we can all learn. We all continually learn. And I think supervisors need to be open to learning from students as well as being positioned as those kind of experts. So in terms of what we're going to do, Tracy already foregrounded this, which is fabulous. So any ideas that people have will be gratefully received. But ACGR is looking to try and develop some guidelines to really help inform future practice. So I think the guidelines need to be a few different levels. I think they need to be at the university level in terms of what needs to change within larger organisations. But I think we also need to have supports that are much more kind of applicable for individuals. So things like the AI that Inga's already spoken about, you know, practically helping people along the way, but also making support access much easier within universities and giving supervisors the tools to have, you know, conversations that they might feel difficult or uncomfortable in terms of providing supports. ultimately, we know that universities have lots of bureaucracy. There's lots of experiences of stigma and otherness. So we really need to start challenging some of the neurotypical assumptions that we have when we move through research. And we've called it a safe enough space. I don't think we can ever develop a 100% safe place for researchers in the future to thrive. And you know, we really want our neurodivergent scholars to thrive. We want them to be leading this research and really pushing the edges as to what we can do. So we need to do better at creating a safe enough space for researchers to really kind of you know, push for advocacy and change within our big organisations. So I think the final slide, Inga.
Yes, sorry, I'm in the chat, chatting in the chat.
No, well done in the chat. I'm trying not to be distracted by the chat because I can't multitask, as you can see. So
yeah,
I guess we've left the last 15 minutes. So over to you, Inga.
Oh yeah, I just sort of thought I'd leave this open if you want to pop a question in here. And like I said, it helps us if your questions, we did it in here because we want to collect questions and use that to guide us, but also happy to take questions in the chat. Thank you to Heidi, I think, who posted the reference to the AI report in universities that I mentioned. And to answer the question from Ollie, we initially put it into a neurodivergence journal. They said this is too niche, and also ironically said this has not got enough statistical studies in it. We're like, well, there aren't any, so how can we include them if they're not there? So that was a bit frustrating. So we took it to Heard. I can't remember the reason we got rejected from Heard. There. Did Diana? Oh, Diana, you're here. I didn't think you would be able to make it. I don't know if you can talk, Diana, because we weren't sure if you could make it, and I said you should be presenting. So I don't know if you want to pop your camera on and say anything at this point. Up to you. Yes. So yes. Co-regulation, super important. How's that shown up or not in work today? Well, that's probably one of the questions we need to tackle through qualitative interviewing, because I don't like the data that we've got is statistical and some open text. So we had what does productivity mean to you? How do you know if you've been productive enough? That's pretty interesting because we've all got different conceptions of it. And then we've got a kind of strategies. What do you do? What works for you at work? And so there's a rich set of strategies that people have shared. I have made the joke that we should write our first paper about noise cancelling headphones, because they seem to be extremely, extremely important in the strategies. All right, so Diana doesn't want to be on camera. Good, you can always talk without your camera on, Diana, but yeah, just inviting you if you want to. All supervisor needs to figure out what's best for their candidates, regardless of neurodivergence or not. That's really true. I like that comment because it speaks to universal design principles. I'm originally an architect, and I was trained to put ramps and stairs, lifts, and doors to be wide enough to get wheelchairs through. And the thing that you know about universal design, if you design that's inclusive, then that suits everyone. If you put a grab rail in a shower, supposedly for an old person, that also helps someone who has a hangover in the morning, right? So that's what I was taught in architecture school. And I think this approach is the one that we should take. But the thing is that maybe all this discussion does is encourage us to treat people like people and to take every individual comes at us actually having individual needs. But there are tensions there with administrative processes, and we can't avoid those either. Anything there that's taking your fancy that you want to talk to, Charlotte or Diana?
I mean, I'm loving seeing the comments coming in, and that idea of safe enough research spaces, I completely agree. It does remind me of that concept of good enough parenting. And I hear from, particularly from the autistic community, that safe enough areas is the best that they can hope for. So I think it's a really important idea. And I think also it's that sense that the comment there that HDR journeys are pretty scary for everyone. And I think that is true. And I think we can do better for everyone. So I think there's a lot of work we can do in terms of making it a safe enough space for all students, and particularly an inclusive space for all students.
I like this question here about, did you include gifted, the literature on gifted adults? I don't know if Tracy's here. Tracy's my go-to about gifted. We've talked about this here and there about there is this sort of crossover in those literature, and I've heard gifted talked about as like non-synchronous developmental pathways. So that means that you're very advanced at something, but not necessarily at another thing. And so, and I see that in my gifted niece, right? So she's an incredible analytical thinker, but has a lot of trouble with emotional regulation. And so that literature, there is some crossover there. And of course, gifted, the gifted community's got a lot to say. So it's definitely an area I'd like to explore some more. I certainly know that some of the people that I meet who have the most struggle as neurodivergent people are people who are have come with that history of gifted with them, which sort of carries some baggage. And I have some of that history myself, actually. It was never like, it was never a good thing, because it kind of excluded you. You were identified in front of your classmates. You were then pigeonholed and tagged as a nerd or whatever, and you live up to people's expectations. But like I said, at the same time, I was then considered deficient. So there was, there's definitely crossovers there. There's so many interesting comments here, really think on. To follow on from universal design thoughts, do we need to call out neurodivergent and actually talk about it's okay to talk about? Or is it just okay to approach it as humans have preferences? I think both. I don't know about you, Charlotte, but I think there's value in actually just naming what's going on. People feel a sense of relief when they disclose to me. I run this thesis bootcamp program at ANU. It's insanely popular. One of the reasons is it provides a sort of space to have a consult just about what's going on with you. And I've had like hundreds of disclosures in that space where they're like, oh, I don't want to tell my supervisor. Or they say to me, I think my supervisor might have ADHD. And I'm like, well, why do you think that? Well, we decided we were going to do X, Y, Z. And then my supervisor came in like, here's this new and shiny thing. And I sometimes think that the rub up of different sort of cognitive styles needs some attention. What do you think, Charlotte?
Yeah, definitely. And I'm distracted reading all of these comments all over the place. There's such insightful and important comments that have been made, and I mean, I think it's about that kind of safe space to actually, be yourself. I'm trying to read both things, but Renee's put in a comment about how can you get an AHD if you can't spell a constant throughout my education. My son's dyslexic. It is a constant battle, and I think sometimes kind of disclosing and making sure that the appropriate helps are in there. But then there's rules around, well, but you're not allowed to use Grammarly, etc., etc. So there's a constant kind of negotiation that's required, which is exhausting. So I think it's a really difficult predicament to be in, especially because of the nature of our industry around research and writing and all of those things.
Can I speak to this point here? Our supervisors would like concrete tips. Okay, so here's concrete tips. Talk about it in front of a big crowd of people. We do it at induction. And we go, hey, some people here are neurodivergent, blah, blah, blah. This is what we're doing, da, 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 da. And that gets more disclosures than anything else, is just saying, hey, we see it. We also attempt to put it in all of our, my team's teaching and research and development. We always try and think about, okay, if the topic is, for instance, note-taking, we can talk about, here are some of the variations that people with ADHD report, and here's some of the variations that people who are autistic report. And hey, isn't it amazing that we all have these different styles of doing it, and you can learn from that. So shut up and write is a very popular, mode of operating inside academia. That was invented by people who have ADHD, who find body doubling, being with someone and doing the same task, as really productive. Another sort of motivation for me is I'm obsessed with productivity. I have a podcast about it. I'm like ridiculously obsessed with it. And a lot of the best productivity techniques I've ever discovered come from the neurodivergent community. Anyone who's familiar with the bullet journal might know the story behind that, is that guy had ADHD and a mother who was a teacher who was just trying to help him. And the bullet journal, I find, helps everyone. So again, coming back to that, if you look at it as a wellspring of creativity and of people solving their own problems, then you start to discover really amazing things within this community. I'm in awe of them. Often.
Definitely.
Charlotte?
And I think kind of someone's written a comment about pushback publicly on the "we're all a little bit" type comments, and I think it's that kind of agitation that I really think we need to be doing across the sector, because it does, as you say, completely minimise the experience and really invalidate some of those experiences that people are having.
Yet at the same time, I would say sometimes that's an invitation to go, so are we? Or have you thought about yourself, what's happening in your family? Like the conversations I've had where someone's gone, oh, blah, everything you're talking about, everyone experiences that. I'm like, well, the literature tells us they don't. So,
Absolutely.
Yeah,
definitely.
And that was my journey too. I was kind of like, oh, this is like resonating with me, all of this.
100%. And I think there's a few comments that cluster around disability services need to better support and need to be better at knowing how to provide appropriate supports. I think that's a really important thing. And I suspect the neurodivergent academic, you're an excellent role model. So I don't think you'll be a terrible role model at all.
Yes. Andrew's got his hand up.
Yeah, just quickly, I just wanted to point out the comment that anyone who's become an academic in the last 10 to 15 years and lived through the ERA era, right, and with the whole publication focus metrics, you would have got like an older academic saying, oh, it was like that when I did my PhD in the early 2000s or the 90s or whatever, and I got through it. You know, we got through it, so you can too. And that if you then read all those comments and that story through a neurodivergent lens, and suddenly like these people, a good proportion, maybe a large proportion of them are neurodivergent, and they're telling themselves this masking narrative. And so suddenly it becomes, you have to mask like we did. Like just how heavy that becomes. Yeah, I just wanted to, picking up on your questions about like, are academics overrepresented? And then when you chuck in the masking and the changes in approach. Yeah, that's all I want to say.
It's such a good comment, Andrew. And it's almost that kind of, well, we had to put up with it, so you can as well. And we need to break those narratives, I think. Particularly those of us who have survived. I was in Britain at that point, but we had a similar kind of organization. So, and I think someone else wrote a comment, I'm sure I've just seen it move through, around those kind of hard deadlines and those kind of RTP milestones that are very much imposed. Can we make HDR study a more kind of inclusive kind of approach where, things are slightly more flexible where needed while still meeting those broader guidelines? I don't know the answer to it, but we definitely need to stop with you just have to do more to achieve the same. 100% agree.
Yeah, and people are people too. Like a neurodivergent candidate say to me the other day, like, can I be an asshole as well as being autistic? Like these things are not conflated together, right? Like people are people first. And they bring with them whatever they're bringing in their body and in their histories, right? So like this thing about, neurodivergent candidates acting negatively, like they often talk to me about stories. I just occupy a kind of privileged position in my university as kind of, I suppose, being an agony aunt to some extent. And some of the stories like, well, don't just assume from us. Like, first of all, don't assume I'm going to be an asshole just because I'm autistic. Also, don't assume that I can't be, just treat me like a person first. And like those ableism just comes and gets you all the time. Like it's just every day I go, oh, that was ableist, that thought, Inga. Or you have to have it pointed out to you. And people can feel embarrassed and ashamed when it's pointed out to them, and that doesn't get us anywhere either.
Ableism is actually central to the university narrative up until 10 years ago.
Sure, I agree. Yeah. I'm just looking at the time.
I was just about to say Tracy will be waving at us very soon, I think, to wrap up.
No, not at all. This is an extremely important conversation, I think, as evidenced by so many people that we have here today. Are there any final, in our last minute, are there any final questions that people would like to ask of Inga or Charlotte?
And please stay in touch. So, you know, if you have questions or comments or anything like that as we move through, you know, we're working on the guidelines. We're still trying to get this SLR published. I'm confident we'll find a home for it. You know, you'll see Inga's work coming through with the surveys and those big kind of data sets. Please, you know, please do stay in touch, and yeah, we'd like to stay in touch with you and continue the conversation. They were the words I was looking for.
Great. We're easy to find. Just Google us.
If you have any problems that way, just email us and we will put you in contact with Inga and Charlotte. Thank you both so much for your presentation today and for doing this work. Obviously, there's a huge gap in the space that needs to be filled, and much appreciative of your efforts to try and fill that. And fingers crossed you'll find a publisher in the very near future. There should be a link to the preprint in the chat. If you can't access that, just shoot me an email and I'll get that across to you. We've recorded this webinar, so this will be available on the ACGR website, as will the presentation slides. So again, thank you so much, Inga and Charlotte, and thank you everyone for being here, and enjoy the remainder of your Friday.
Thanks for the opportunity. See you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.